Frank Walker, a retired private investigator with a gift for finding what others missed, stepped onto the trail alone. By dusk, his footprints vanished, but Helen knew her husband. Methodical, cautious, never careless. The mountains swallowed him whole. As the authorities shrug off another lost hiker, Helen whispers the truth no one will say aloud. What secret did Frank stumble over that led the shadows to finally catch him? Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I read every single one. Frank Walker always kept his promises, especially to Helen. That Monday, with the sun barely cresting over the pines outside their cottage, he scribbled a note on the kitchen counter. Gone to the summit, back for dinner. His hiking boots made soft thuds against the porch, the distant whistle of a jay echoing through the morning haze. Helen watched him set off, his stride sure and steady, every step the mark of a man who'd spent decades following trails as much as clues. She lingered a moment, caught between pride and a strange ache, never imagining that note might be the last words he'd ever leave. Helen made coffee, each pour stretching into quiet worry. Frank always double-checked his gear, compass, notebook, that faded blue backpack patched from years of adventure. By noon, the mountain air grew thin with unease. She expected his call. He'd promised to check in after reaching the ridge, but the phone stayed silent. Afternoon settled, hours crawling past as Helen circled the house, eyes flicking to the clock, heart pounding against a rising tide of dread. Sunset painted the pines gold, but Frank's note on the counter remained untouched, a promise unfulfilled. When darkness settled, Helen called the ranger's outpost, voice trembling. The search began, flashlights scattering among fir trees and tangled roots, the searchers shouting his name into the endless wild. But only silence answered back. Helen sat by the window all night, untouching her mug as the house filled with shadows. Each passing hour chipped away hope, replacing it with a desperate resolve. She replayed Frank's every habit in her mind, how he never strayed from marked trails, how he checked forecasts and packed redundant supplies, a man prepared for anything except vanishing. When dawn broke, the search shifted into urgency. Uniformed officers combed the ridgelines and creek beds. Dogs sniffed the mossy ground where Frank's boots should have left prints. Neighbors offered words, casseroles, theories. The sheriff spoke in that slow, careful way reserved for lost causes. He's experienced. Mountains can fool anyone, he said gently, but Helen met his eyes, unblinking. Frank was never a fool, she replied. A week passed, then another. The newspapers printed his photo. Retired PI disappears on solo hike. But the world moved on, and official searches halted. Helen boxed up Frank's books, his maps, and his old case files, unable to part with any of it, unwilling to let go of the smallest detail that might matter. Still, a stubborn ember burned inside her. If anyone could help, it was Frank himself, leaving clues in the chaos. And Helen, grief-stricken but undaunted, vowed she wouldn't stop searching until she learned the truth of what waited for him, alone on that mountain. It was the fourth spring since Frank vanished when Helen received the call that changed everything. Ranger Matthews spoke cautiously, hesitant hope threading his words. Mrs. Walker, hikers found something downstream from Bear Creek. It's a notebook, waterlogged but with your husband's initials. Helen gripped the phone, pulse roaring in her ears. She drove the familiar route up the winding road, wildflowers nodding in the morning breeze, memories crowding every bend. At the ranger station, Matthews placed the battered notebook on the desk. Its once black cover had faded to gray, corners warped by time and water. Helen's hand shook as she opened the first page. Frank's neat handwriting, hard to read through mud-stained paper, still managed to leap from the page. Half-finished sentences, coordinates, cryptic symbols, and a single line circled in red. Ridgeway, insurance fraud, someone watching. Matthews cleared his throat. We found it trapped under driftwood. GPS data's degraded, but we know it came from somewhere upriver. Helen's breath caught. It wasn't just a notebook. It was a breadcrumb, a signpost left for her, or anyone who cared to look beyond the obvious answers. Helen looked out past the window, into the thickening pine. Maybe Frank hadn't simply wandered into trouble. Maybe the last case he ever worked was the one that followed him into the wild. Helen returned home clutching the notebook like a relic. She spread maps across the kitchen table, tracing the coordinates Frank had jotted down. Something buried deep in those numbers gnawed at her, a path off the main trail, veering toward Ridgeway Ravine and past old logging sites. Determined, she called Pete Ramirez, Frank's closest friend and fellow retired PI. Pete arrived that afternoon, gruff but kind, voice carrying the weight of hundreds of unsolved cases. Together, they studied Frank's cryptic notes, references to old insurance claims, initials she recognized from Frank's stories, and subtle warnings about forces above the law. "He was onto something big," Pete muttered, brows furrowed. "This isn't just a simple hike gone wrong." Helen nodded. Frank never let a thread unravel without pulling it. They dug deeper, visiting the local library for old news reports, interviewing former Ridgeway employees, and piecing together whispers about sudden settlements and missing records. Each night, Helen pored over the notebook, deciphering passages, a pattern emerging. Frank had been receiving messages, veiled threats, from someone tied to a decades-old fraud that ruined lives and vanished millions. The last page held a torn scrap, a phone number scribbled hastily and the words, "If anything happens to me, start with Ridgeway." Helen knew her search had only begun. Whatever waited in those woods, or the shadows behind Ridgeway's clean facade, was the reason Frank disappeared. And now, she'd chase the truth, just as he would have wanted. The following morning, Helen dialed the number from Frank's note. After 2 tense rings, a man answered, a cautious, gravelly voice. "This is Ridgeway Security." Helen hesitated, then said, "I'm calling about Frank Walker." A long pause, then a change in tone. "I can't talk here. Meet me at the Willow Diner, noon. Come alone." Pete trailed Helen in a separate car, watching her slip into a corner booth as rain speckled the glass. The contact, James Holloway, former Ridgeway claims adjuster, looked shrunken, nervous. He recognized Helen immediately, his eyes darting to the door. "I knew Frank," Holloway whispered, voice trembling. "He asked too many questions about payouts and missing files. After he disappeared, someone came to my house, told me to forget everything. People think Ridgeway's clean, but it's not. Old managers got run out. Anyone digging too deep gets the message." "What happened to Frank?" Helen's voice was steady. "I don't know, but I heard he met someone up at Bear Creek. Said he'd found proof. He left me this." Holloway slid a small data card across the table. "It's passwords, spreadsheets. He wanted someone outside Ridgeway to have them. Said if he went missing, use these." Helen's heart hammered. Proof. Frank's last safeguard. Outside, Pete watched a sleek car idle at the curb, 2 men inside. When Holloway exited, they followed him, steps too purposeful to ignore. Helen slipped the data card into her purse and left, her resolve steelier than ever. Someone was watching. Someone didn't want the secrets inside Frank's notebook, or on that card, exposed. Helen and Pete knew. The mountain hadn't just claimed a hiker. It had swallowed a secret worth killing for. And now, as storm clouds gathered, Helen was closer than ever to its heart. That evening, Helen and Pete pored over the data card in her living room, the computer's glow painting anxious lines on their faces. Dozens of files appeared, insurance policies, altered claims, emails that suggested hush money exchanged by Ridgeway executives. Frank had managed to copy incriminating evidence, enough to ruin reputations and put men behind bars. Helen's hands shook. This is why he disappeared. A sudden pounding at the door froze them. Pete quietly slipped to the window, whispering, "Unmarked car across the street." Helen hurriedly hid the card inside a hollow in Frank's old chessboard. The knock came again, more insistent. Helen opened the door a crack. 2 men in crisp suits stood outside. The taller one flashed a polite but chilling smile. "Evening, ma'am. We're with the Ridgeway recovery team. We heard you had questions about your husband's disappearance. Helen fought to steady her voice. I've talked to the police. There's nothing more. The men exchanged glances. Sometimes family stirs up old business. We just want to help you find closure. Thank you, Helen said, but I have all I need. She closed the door, heart thrumming, and locked the deadbolt. Pete placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He knew they'd come poking around. We'll take this to the police first thing in the morning. But Helen barely slept. Outside, the unmarked car sat idling, its shadow looming into dawn. She realized Frank's final case wasn't finished. She was now his partner, and somewhere in the documents, the piece that could topple Ridgway was waiting to be found. The hunt wasn't over. It was just beginning. At sunrise, Helen drove straight to the county police station with Pete by her side, the chessboard carefully wrapped in her bag. Detective Reyes greeted her with a furrowed brow. He'd led the initial search for Frank, and now, looking at Helen's trembling hands, knew something big had surfaced. She handed over the data card and explained everything. Frank's suspicious notes, Holloway's warning, the late-night visitors, and the unmarked car still watching her house. Pete filled in details from their own investigation, missing records, names tied to old fraud cases, threats lingering at the edges of their search. Reyes examined the evidence, jaw tightening as he scrolled through spreadsheets, scanned altered claims, and tallied figures that screamed of millions stolen. This is more than just a disappearance, Mrs. Walker. The level of fraud and intimidation here means we're calling in the feds. Within an hour, agents from the FBI arrived. Helen signed sworn statements, provided every notebook and map Frank had left behind, and described every suspect and conversation, her voice steady now, purpose eclipsing grief. Outside, law enforcement surrounded Ridgway's offices. Warrants were executed, emails seized, and men in suits led out in handcuffs. The local news flashed headlines. Retired PI's final clues reveal insurance scandal. Helen Walker's pursuit breaks open case. Helen stood outside the station, watching the ripple of justice, her heart heavy with loss, but buoyed by vindication. Pete smiled gently at her. He'd be proud, you know. Helen closed her eyes, feeling the mountain's presence, knowing somewhere Frank was at peace, his final case closed by the person he trusted most. Days blurred with media interviews and statements, but one cold morning, Helen's phone rang again, Detective Reyes, voice both gentle and solemn. Helen, we think we've located the site Frank's GPS last pinged. We have a team ready to search the ridge. Helen made the journey with Pete, her steps slow through dew-damp grass, heart pounding at every rustle in the woods. The team hiked miles off trail, braving brambles and slippery stone, until at the edge of a rocky overlook, a ranger called out. "We've found something!" Frank's faded jacket was tangled in brush, half buried where the ground dropped steeply. Nearby, a rusted thermos and his compass lay undisturbed, a silent testament to his final moments. Reyes knelt beside Helen as recovery workers carefully retrieved the remains. "He left us clues for everything but his own fate," Reyes said softly. Helen gripped Pete's hand, tears streaking her cheeks. This was closure, a goodbye forged in courage. She knelt beside the compass, whispering, "You brought them the truth, love. You weren't lost. You were fighting for something bigger." Word spread quickly. Frank Walker, the PI who never gave up, had solved his last case from beyond the grave. Ridgway's corrupt network was dismantled, justice served for every victim. And Helen, holding the compass that pointed home, knew her husband's legacy, like the mountain, would endure. That night, Helen sat by the window, staring at the silhouette of distant peaks. Shadows faded, and in their place, sunrise promised hope. For every mystery solved, another story waited on the horizon, one she'd tell for Frank, for herself, and for every truth hidden by darkness. At the memorial service, neighbors, friends, and officers filled the chapel, each holding memories of Frank, the cases he cracked, communities he protected, the wisdom he shared over coffee or counsel on long walks. Helen stood by a table lined with keepsakes, a photograph of Frank grinning in his hiking jacket, his old notebook, the compass that never lost its way. When it came time to speak, Helen's voice was soft but unwavering. She recounted Frank's relentless pursuit of truth, his unfailing loyalty, and how, even in disappearance, he'd mapped a path for justice. "Frank believed there's always light at the end of the darkest trail," she said, glancing at the crowd. "He taught me not to fear the shadows, but to walk straight through them." Afterward, families touched by Ridgway's fraud approached her with tears, gratitude, and stories of how Frank's legacy had changed their fates. Pete, ever loyal, squeezed her shoulder. "I've worked with a lot of good men. None better." That evening, as Helen walked home past the mountain now edged in gold, she realized the story was bigger than loss. Frank had passed his courage to her, and to everyone who believed, even wearily, that the truth matters. In her study, Helen opened Frank's last notebook, running her hand over the embossed cover. There were other cases, unanswered questions inked along its margins. She smiled, a different, bittersweet kind of hope settling in. Maybe, she thought, some mysteries are meant to be shared. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to tell the next story. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, Helen tucked away Frank's compass and notebook, symbols of a truth uncovered and a love that endured. Though the shadows of his final case had faded, the promise of new mysteries remained. She gazed out the window, knowing that every answer uncovered was only the beginning. There are always more secrets, more stories waiting to be told. Helen's journey is far from over, and as long as there are truths to chase, the archives will never close. Keep watching the Witness Archives. More untold mysteries are waiting just around the bend.